Yeah, everyone, whatever business it is concentrating on performance and faster.
Yeah.
Also, sort of rattled around in my head is the calculations of the cost of lost productivity based on an optimised human. So, just conceptualising the idea of if the computer system was perfect, what's that expectation on the human for ultimate output of their time. So per hour, we're expecting to concentrate dedicatedly for 60-minute blocks or 20-minute blocks, or what that breakdown of human behaviour is throughout the workday, and the ebbs and flow of where the alpha and the theta and the beta waves all mingle together throughout a workday, and how that plays into
because you've got like circadian rhythms, like every 90 minutes you go through a bit of a trough.
Yeah.
And,
a lot of time with the shower cap on, getting those to affect your brain.
I think from my point of view, it's like maybe not that you have to be the perfect employee and you always kind of like focus everything, but I think taking some of these distractions out of it is just like taking some noise out of the system. So it's like things that are artificially getting in the way, and you're doing things when you want to do them. So you maybe want to use that app to do that thing now because it's in your mind and you want to get it done. But if it's slow, obviously that's going to impede you, and then it's going to be pissed off, or like idiots in the back room can't bloody organise themselves.
Performance guys didn't do their
That's
job.
right. I'm a performance capacity, and I'm trying to use one of the big apps at IBM, and it runs like a dog, and it's like, these guys do it. Who's actually looking? Is anyone looking at performance with this tool? Everyone's using it.
But the point that you've made about slowness of the application and stuff, this also, this is where we engage with our products. Now, I'm not going to make it a sales pitch here, but I'm just telling, whatever, even IBM has products, HP has products, we have our products. What it's doing is that, let me explain you a simple example. I was at the airport last week in Brisbane. I was at the check-in counter, self-check-in, that kiosk machine there. And there were like 10, 15 of those at the Sydney airport, at the Virgin counter. And there was, all of them were full. There was a lady standing just next to me, and she was like, damn, this shit doesn't work. And the other 9 were working perfectly fine. Each of that kiosk is connected to a central application, which is the same application. It's using the same hardware, same network. But still, out of the 10, one is experiencing a very different transaction type and very dismal performance, and the other 9 are not. This is where we also get into the fact that when you say, this application is not performing well, is it really the application that is not performing well? Or is it the components that make up the architecture of that application? Is it the network that is at the fault? Is it the database which is going slow? Is it the server which is not supporting? Is it the application itself? So that's where we're seeing customers are having more and more focus, especially e-commerce customers whose business is heavily reliant on transactions, banks, heavily reliant on transactions. Now they are giving more and more prominence to the fact that I really want to know what's going wrong in this transaction. That's the reason we have all the vendors, all the companies have introduced synthetic transaction tools, wherein they say that it's a robot doing a particular transaction every few seconds, but they need to do that so that they can know if there's something wrong. That typical 3 a.m. problem when no one knows about it. So, yeah. Very good presentation. Thanks for that.
So how do you want to do it? Do you want to just do you just want to chat, or do you want to do the next one?
What's the next one?
What's the next one?
So the next one is, so I put together, so generally we have two, we have two slots in any of these. That's typically what we don't need to necessarily be always the same. And I try to structure it with first one being technical, and that's what we've done in Melbourne. The first one being technical, and the next one basically being career development oriented. Now, that takes time. You got to get speakers, you got to basically have a community. So the one that I had was the mistakes that you make. So this is experience of the last 15 years in terms of the mistakes that we make and how we botch things up. Okay. So we don't in the I mean it's 6:24. What do you want to do? Do you want me to skim through the slides?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Okay.
It's the first time.
Okay, so I'll skim through the slides. I won't bore you to death. But if there are specific, I want to make this more of a discussion. And I've tried my best to reduce the text on it. But the intention is more to have a discussion as compared to just rattle stuff off. Okay. So this is based on my personal experiences over the last 15 years. Doesn't necessarily mean it's what the whole world does. Right? There is a different perspective. Each one of you bring a different perspective. So this is my limited perspective and just my experience and what I have seen. Okay. So, what message do you take away? Just by looking at that, what message do you take away?
Don't show me something better.
Sorry?
Don't show me something better, just leave me alone.
Okay. What else? And look at it in context of performance.
I can't be bothered with performance system.
Can't be bothered. What else? What are the other perspectives?
It's like it's good enough how it is. I don't want to have. I've got to get my stuff. So there's a deadline I've got to achieve, and if I stop,
Yeah.
it's like I may not meet my deadline, so
Okay.
I go away kind of thing. Yeah.
What else? What do you think? There's a key term I'm looking for.
This looks to me like life in sales.
There's one more key word a key phrase I'm looking for. Don't.
It's not broke, don't fix it.
Don't fix it. Yes. What else? And one more. The wheel. What does the wheel say?
Don't reinvent the wheel.
Don't reinvent the wheel. What do you think we do every day? So let me not say you. So what do you think me and my customers and all of us do every day on each of these programs? The last 15 years, every program reinvents the wheel. Every program reinvents the wheel. Right? And when I refer to performance, I'm not just referring to. So I guess the difference is, right, I don't look at performance as performance testing. Don't get me wrong. It's not that I have a disdain for performance testing. I've been doing a lot of it, fortunately, unfortunately. But when I mean performance, I basically mean the performance of the system from an end consumer standpoint, from an end user standpoint, from a business standpoint. That's what I mean. So when I say performance, I don't mean performance testing or capacity. I mean performance of the system and what the end user sees it. And don't we all, do you think, correct me if I'm wrong, have you seen your customers reinvent the wheel within the same organization, different business units, doing the same thing again and again, making the same mistakes again and again?
Yeah.
And they keep doing it. And I'm sure it's not limited to performance. I'm sure it is the same in a whole lot of other areas, and that's probably what sets mediocre businesses from high performing businesses, right? And that's the difference, right? So that's in a nutshell. I've got 4 or 5 slides, not a lot. Agile, I'm not over here to talk about Agile, but for those of you who have actually worked in the Agile world, how do you bake performance in? Just in terms of interest, how do you bake performance into an Agile cycle? The Agile development cycle, right, which is small sprints. So you do all your, you create a product backlog, which is nothing but a list of things that need to get developed, right? You feed it into the sprint, you've got daily, weekly, whatever sprints, you do a whole lot of stuff, you release it, and then it goes back, right? How, based on your experience, how have people baked performance into that?
It's performance-based development, like test-driven development.
Yeah, so how
into the unit test framework.
Part of the release cycle.
sorry?
Part of the release cycle.
Part of the release cycle?
Before you release it to production, whatever else, part of the solution will be to test
Performance tested.
Performance
Okay.
tested.
It's like a continual user story or whatever it's called.
But tell me, how do you, and again, this is not, I'm not trying to preach to you anything, I'm just trying to learn myself. How do you bake performance into that cycle? Is it that I build the application and then I get to test and then I shove it into the test environment and test it out and hope that it'll work?
There's 2 ways that I've seen people do it. One is to have a performance budget. So every part of the infrastructure and every component of the application has its own performance budget, and it has unit tests that can actually test that performance.
Okay.
and if someone ships an update or tries to ship an update that breaks their part of the stack, that breaks the SLA for their part of the stack, then it gets bounced.
Okay, cool. So you have budgets defined for each one of the tiers across.
That's what Google does.
Where do you define, but how, in your experience, where have you seen your customers define those budgets? What part of the Scrum cycle do they do that? Is that just, based on experience, or do they actually go about, via a well-defined scientific practice and say, okay, this is the industry benchmark, this is what we see in our environment, this is how, and what part of the Scrum cycle would they define those requirements?
Usually what happens is that they run a performance sprint or two where the features are actually
delivered first.
The features are actually the incremental improvements in performance.
Right.
So
okay.
you take performance as a feature literally.
Okay, and then you work on it as a feature. Okay, gotcha.
And then once you've got up to a baseline, then you use the baseline you baseline every component of the infrastructure, and you
right.
test it, and then you make that part of your...
Fantastic. Okay, so performance is just like a feature within the backlog. It's just another feature. That's interesting. Any other perspectives?
It has to be reused at each phase, right?
Sorry?
It has to be reused at each phase of delivery.
What do you mean reuse?
Would it not? Because if you're introducing, from an Agile perspective, you're introducing a whole solution in parts. I would assume you'd need to performance
absolutely, you would need to. Absolutely, you're right. Absolutely, yep, you're right. Any other perspectives anyone would like to share? With regards
Yeah, just would normally allow a degradation of the application performance with new enhancements.
right.
But you see a few degradations that would trigger off the need to go back and do code assessment, find out what has gone wrong with this application.
Okay.
To significantly affect the end user performance.
Okay, that's pretty cool.
They've got continuous integration in their build cycles.
Excellent. So there's this automatic.
And the unit tests can have their benchmarks defined, and the degradation should be able to
Be able to pick them up. Okay.
Code analysis basis.
Okay.
On the build.
On the build itself, yeah, and that happens on an nightly basis, yeah.
As opposed to a fully integrated system that's being driven just from a user perspective.
Okay, cool.
So I used to have the performance test go, we had dev, SAT, PST.
Yep.
Performance stress test is the last, but that's more stress test of the application suite as a whole.
Yeah.
We used to do a performance test when we go between each of the SDLC levels to make sure that, like, dev is obviously where you play around.
Yep.
Pick product integration testing. So you've got the development code on the developer workstation, and gets out of there into product integration testing. Does it still work well enough in there? And into system integration testing. Is it working within the system of all the different applications? Are the response times between point A and point B acceptable?
Okay.
All the way up through the...
All the way up to the chain. Okay, cool. Okay, that's interesting. So from a waterfall... Sorry?
Many years of my life.
So with the waterfall model, right, which is very different, rather than the iterative process where you go through quick short sprints, the waterfall model is very different, right? And most of the experience that a lot of us would have had, and especially me in the waterfall model, is you define your requirements up front, you do your detailed design, you do your implementation. This is the V model, right, which is what a whole lot of consulting companies and delivery companies would focus on. What challenges do you see in this cycle? I mean, how would you address performance in a waterfall model?
Time. It takes time.
Where would you start? Where would you start? Would you
Non-functional requirements.
start with the non-functional requirements? What else? And then from non-functional you will progress to where would you go next? Where do you think you would logically go next? I mean, you start with the non-functionals at the start. From non-functionals, you would then ideally basically do unit performance tests. You would have the unit test framework, which does a whole lot of tests. You would then basically move onto performance tests or integrated tier performance tests if you're lucky enough to have a segregated environment where you can test each one of the individual tiers, and then you do your integrated performance tests.
So for a new system?
For a new system?
Or for
both.
Incremental?
For incremental it'll be slightly different. Yes, you're right. Yeah. But the bottom line is, right, I mean, the biggest challenges that we found, both with Agile and with Waterfall, whatever whichever one you might want to look at, it's the fact that people just fail to define their requirements. And I don't want to blame anyone, including my customers and the organizations I work with. Just poorly defined requirements, and that's where most of the problems start. Okay, so I've got 4 or 5 slides. Just want to summarize the learning, right, in terms of what is it that, where could we not, what could we do to not make the same mistakes. So try to see the bigger picture, right? Performance is not just about technology, right? A lot of us are very passionate about technology. We're passionate about technology, we're passionate about concepts.
Sorry, could you go back to your previous point where you said that poorly documented
Non-functional requirements. Yeah.
Could you elaborate on that point? What do you mean by that to the customers?
So non-functional requirements. So there are two. Generally, when you look at requirements across the spectrum, you've got functional, which talks about aspects of different features, right? Tangible features which the user can see. And you have the non-tangible part, which is scalability, failover, reliability, availability, all the T's, security, and things like that. They're not tangible, right? For example, I want the system to scale to 10,000 concurrent users, right, at 50 TPS, right, driving 70% utilization across my 10 servers and 80%, not more than 80% memory utilization and 30% network. That's a very clearly defined non-functional requirement. Where will you find it? Not in the last 15 years have I found one single customer with the level of maturity to define that. Why is that so? Why is it that we focus so much on writing good functionals and we don't put, and that includes me, I'm not pointing fingers, includes me and my organization, my customers, very little focus on non-functionals. Because that's where the problem starts, don't you think? Most of us don't agree. When I speak to the architects, we don't agree on what the non-functionals are. Or even the interpretation of those non-functionals varies so much that by the time you get into performance test, you're not on the same page. Your customer has got one view of performance, right? Your customer's got his own view of what the non-functionals are. The systems administrators have got their view of the non-functionals, right? The architects have got their view of the non-functionals, and from a performance tester, I've got my view of non-functionals. So everyone's got a different view. That's the point I was making.
That's exactly what I wanted to hear, because coming from a very similar business world, so we belong to the SI world of IT. I believe in the last few years what I saw, I heard this a lot of times, people saying that the customer is not really defining the requirements very clearly. And I think we are running behind something and cribbling on something that will just not happen. If the customers would be in a position to define the requirements clearly, there would be no existence of companies like Accenture, IBM and stuff. There is no point having those companies if the customer can define the requirements, because once he's defined the requirements clearly, all he needs is 5 people, 5 technicians, 5 experts to address those 5 issues which can actually solve the problem.
Spot on. It's spot on.
Functional problem. What I really feel is that the gap is from the. I'm sorry. I'll just take a minute. The gap is also from the IT companies, from our side, the SI world of people, or the technology world, because we are so engrossed into our own requirements that all we can understand is requirements in our language. We need to understand the customer is going to explain requirements in his language. That's the reason we have domain experts who can actually translate that into technical requirements or help us understand the requirements better. This point of the requirements not being clear will never be resolved, and to me it's not a problem at all.
Okay.
This is bread and butter for companies like us, because the day they start defining their requirements, it's done, finished.
So spot on.
My opinion was just that the customer may specify non-functional requirements, they be very specific, but still may be wrong. So they could specify, say, response times which are unachievable for the architecture.
Absolutely. So could be.
Yeah.
Could be.
So I'm saying, like, even though they're specific, they not be.
You're right.
Achievable.
So here's my take on that, right? So when I say that we don't define non-functionals, I mean we as the industry. I don't mean we as the customer. The customer is someone I'm servicing. So who's at fault? All of us are at fault, including me, right? Would I blame the customer? I would blame all of us. We just don't talk about it enough. There is just not enough importance given to performance, right? What is performance looked at? You take a poll in this room, or you take a poll in any organization. Performance is performance test. What is performance test? Fundamentally a reactive process which is run at the end of the life cycle. There you go. How are you going to fix anything if you don't have requirements up front? Spot on, right? So again, it is all of us, including me. Don't get me wrong, I've worked for multiple consulting companies and the situation is the same everywhere. You're spot on. So I'm absolutely with you on that, right? So with the bigger picture, again, and this is pure experience, right? And some of it you might agree, some of it you might not agree. My perspective, performance is not a point in time process. It's across the life cycle, right? All of us tend to look at performance test. Performance test is reactive. It's right at the end, very critical, very important. But that's not going to get you out of it. You got to help define it up front. Do your proof of concepts, right? Do your architecture and design, and do as much as you can up front so that towards the end you've got lesser amount of pain, right? High performance outcomes to business, like you were saying earlier, right? At the end of the day, what really matters is the end customer experience, and that's what really matters. But going back, I used to view performance, and I'm talking about me and the people that I worked with, as tools, as technology, right? As performance testing. But performance testing is about business outcomes, right? If we could start looking at performance as business outcomes, it would be greater value delivered to the customer and to all of us, right? Focus on buying and selling the value proposition. This is one other thing I think as performance engineers, as people in the performance space, we fail to do. We are so passionate about performance testing, about capacity planning and capacity management, but how many of us take the time at the time, and some of us are lucky to actually be part of the statement of work when the RFP is being released. How much of us actually take the time to influence that, create the value proposition? Because that's where it is, right? 99% of my customers have not invested in performance, not because they didn't want to, they just didn't know about it. For them, performance was, hey, I'll bring a few, nice test guys towards the end, I'll run a test and then done and dusted. So it's us, and that's why I say it is us to blame, because we just don't talk about it enough. And that value proposition is just so important for people to understand, for business to understand. Right? And as I think Ben, you demonstrated really well through your numbers how the value proposition can turn from not just from response times into actual monetary gains. And performance test is not performance engineering or whatever. Performance management includes a whole lot of activities across the life cycle, with performance a very small part of it. I won't bring in the slide, but basically the same thing that we've been discussing. Lack of good NFRs is some of the most common reasons why systems fail. Keep your NFRs simple, measurable, right? I come from programs where my teams, and I'll be very clear, my teams have defined NFRs that basically say between 5 and 10 seconds. What do you mean, right? All transactions on the system between 5 and 10 seconds. I've also gone to clients where people with complex systems like SAP commit to all transactions less than 3 seconds. Now, where's the middle line? Is one more appropriate than the other? Not really, right? It's context sensitive. Everything is so much dependent on business. But again, at the end of the day, I guess what we've got to realize is with NFRs, we've got to be very specific and very clear. So they've got to be measurable, they've got to be achievable, they've got to be stuff that is realistic and time related. And the other thing which we found is get people to buy into NFRs, right? I think one of the biggest challenges I've seen with performance is, we go in with, hey, we can do this, technically it's all achievable. But no one's on my side, no one's really on my side. It's I've got the tools in, I've got all the required capability in, but I really don't have buy-in. And then what I find, and this is through my own experience and my own failures, is because you're on these programs where things are just being pushed through, right? There are massive releases going through. Performance is right at the bottom of the scale. It's not on anyone's radar. And spending time just building those human connections, forget the technical connections. The technical connections are easy to build. Finding time to build those human connections helps me a lot more, right? And that's where we're referring to buying. Just sharing my experiences. Might not necessarily be true in all cases, right? Investing in an architecture that doesn't scale, and this is really interesting. I've worked on really large programs where we bought very, very expensive products. Won't take names, all of us are a part of large programs, very expensive products, right? chuck them in, the vendor's basically giving you a benchmark, and the vendor's benchmark says this is going to fly at 10,000 TPS. Fantastic. You chuck it all in, 12 months down the line, that's when you want to, that's when, you know, everyone says, oh, now we got to invest in performance, and that's when you do your performance test and everything falls over. Simple things. Could we just run a proof of concept? You know, I tell the architects, guys, you're putting millions of dollars in this. Run a small proof of concept. Do, you know, try to. It's easier said than done. It's a lot easier said than done, because especially, you know, when as consultants we are brought onto a program, everything's done and dusted already. But what I would encourage, and especially if you can influence it, is run a small proof of concept. Validate what the vendor says.
Oh, sorry, I was having a laugh at the anti-patterns. We used to have a rather large bunch of anti-patterns at most departments I've worked at. And strange enough, going through two of the major departments, it's the same guy generated it. You never actually usually even see that the designs he puts up don't work, but he has all the political push and pull to get them through, and they fail. So he blames everyone else.
Yeah, that's interesting. Is there, I mean, any other pointers? Anything else that you can think of? I mean, these are just, you know, thoughts that I put together in terms of, right? Yeah, again, third-party components. You know, from some of my programs, I've seen a lot of complicated stuff. You know, people love complicated architectures. They love saying, you know, standing in front of the CIO and saying complicated architectures, third-party components, service bus, and da-da-da-da. Why? I mean, you know, we build systems which go to, you know, the other side of the world to access a customer database. Why? Why can't you just have it sitting locally? Why do you need to buy a large expensive solution when you could build something really small, and, you know, things like that. Now obviously I'm trying to oversimplify, but the point I was trying to make is, when you're in the performance space, ask questions, right? And you'll find a lot of times that there is a lot of room for simplification.
The least number of moving parts is always faster.
Sorry?
The least number of moving parts.
What's it faster? Yeah.
It's always going to be faster.
Yeah.
But again, you have the problems of sometimes for security reasons you can't have the data that you're trying to access on your
Locally.
machine or
Absolutely.
in a local context.
Yeah.
So you know you go against something that's stored somewhere else behind multiple firewalls, and you can only access it on port whatever number it is, using protocol whatever it is. And that will be, and when you hop through all those firewalls, you're going to have problems.
Yeah, that's so true. Just to add to that, I had a customer, I can't give you the name, but you probably all of you know them. They deployed an application which the whole of Australia uses. Part of the application sits over here in Australia. There is a customer management system which sits in the US. And there is a storage, there is part of the storage which basically sits on the other side of the world. So there are three different components, and the reason why I did this, and you probably, I've got a slide, is because it's cloud. We've got this thing called the cloud, which is so sexy, everyone wants to jump on top of it, right? Little realizing that I'm getting a cloud component from there, and a cloud component from here, and a cloud component from here. But when I stitch all those sexy components together, the whole thing isn't that sexy anymore. Things like that. But spot on. Yeah. So again, tools. This is something I found, you know, just in terms of just sharing of experiences. Tons of tools around. Most of the time we find tools don't work, and then we crib, including I crib a lot. You know, you go into accounts and there are so many tools, but you ask the customer what does really work, and nothing really works. Or if it works, it gives you data in a form that's really not useful. So, you know, I guess you got to live with what you have, and make good of the situation, right? Just some thoughts. Executing SVD in a scaled-down environment. Any experiences? Or, you know, executing performance tests. Have you had situations where customers have said, hey, my production is going to be 50 boxes, but my test environment is 25. Run a test and tell me if it will work in production or not.
That's how they all do it. It's more down to the, as long as your pre-production environment is a good representation of production, and you can extrapolate out what's going to look like with more users and fast response on whatever. There can be a reasonable test, but most times I haven't seen it
scale
done. Because you've got, and your third point that you mentioned, virtual, that's fine, but your virtual environment in the pre-production environment is always going to be on a different time CPU set, different patch level, slower networking, older SAN, older NAS, than in production.
Absolutely, spot on. So you got to be careful about those things, right? I mean, you know, I've made mistakes a couple of times actually, where we run tests in the test environment, and then we try to correlate those tests from the test environment to the production. It's not the same. And you think, why? Because the over allocation, in virtualization, they've got these allocation ratios, which is how many physical CPUs to how many virtual CPUs. It's generally higher in a test environment because you want larger utilization. In a production environment, it is generally low. It might not be the case in all organizations, but some of our larger customers. And then you have test results which don't compare, things like that. But anyway, all that I was trying to suggest in this is, at the end of the day, be careful, especially when you're working across environments. What you generate in one environment is not necessarily going to be linearly, you might not be able to extrapolate that in the other environment.
What's the solution to that?
Good
Because
question.
I mean,
Yeah.
look at it from
Yeah.
the business
Smart.
perspective.
What do you do?
Even till date, IT is looked upon as a cost center.
Yep.
It's not an innovation center. It's not actually boosting your business, though it might be, yes, but it's looked towards as a cost center. Let me take the example. Let's say Woolworths.
Yeah.
Because I've worked at Woolworths, and let me take that example. You
Yeah.
said that 20 servers in pre-production, and actually there are like 100 servers.
Yeah.
So, is the solution that we should try and replicate production as much as possible? Let's say 200 servers
Yeah.
in pre-production stage. If that'll be the case, the end product cost would go up because ultimately you are consuming in a lot of dollars, and it's taking a hit on the business, and ultimately everyone's here to make money.
Spot on.
So, what's the solution?
What
to
is the
this
solution?
then?
Yeah.
The solution I had to that at DHS
Yeah.
was that when we bought more hardware for whatever purpose,
Yeah.
the hardware is not seen as here's your pre-production, here's your production hardware.
Yeah.
Now it's seen as here is your hardware. It's shared for both production and pre-production. So when you do your testing in your hardware chunk, it's on the same type of hardware as what for pre-production and production usage. It's just that you'll get allocated a chunk of your hardware for application X, whatever that is. It's up to them to go, oh, I need to have less usage in pre-production than in production. That's how it works.
Yeah.
That worked for us, but we still had constraints.
So, Anubhav, there is no right answer. There's no right answer. The intention of the slide was not to say, hey, you got to push 100% capacity all the time. I will push. Obviously, I will push because I know when I have to stand in front of the CIO and I've got to, look at him in the eye and I've got to tell him, okay, your business is not going to follow when it goes live. So, if I have to do that, I've got to make sure that I have the right information. So you're right, 90% of my customers will not give me production equivalent capacity. But the intention of the slide was just to suggest that when you're extrapolating, be very careful. Your customer is always going to push you by giving you 50% or lesser and make you forecast for 100%. And guess what? It's not possible. No magician in this world can run a 50% test and tell you if the 100% is going to work.
Yeah, so I guess being aware of it is one of the solutions, so that you know what you're dealing with. And I think it's not an answer per se, but it's much better to understand whether you're in a situation where your environment is scaling equally across all of its tiers, or whether it's got a skewed scaling. So you might have 1/5 of the app, the app server scale of production, but you might have 1/16 on a database level. You might have, if it's. I had a situation of doing some pre-analysis of the environment comparisons to see what we're dealing with in a certain circumstance, and I had this skewed scaling circumstance. I just think, look, we've either. I'm not even going to go there because we can have a crack at extrapolation and interpolation of the results we had. If we were scaled equally across all the tiers, potentially. Now, I don't know if that was the right approach to take. I'd love to hear your guys' take on that. But it seemed like a more theoretically reasonable thing to do to have an equally scaled thing across all the tiers as opposed to this skewed.
It's very difficult
situation.
to have that
It is
situation.
difficult,
And
no
I
doubt
will
about
tell
it.
you, I was bidding for one of the US clients. This is a couple of years back, and that was by far the most successful client in this scenario. That's the reason I'm asking you this question. What got into you guys? You've been in this place and done all of that. what's the answer, what's the solution to this, because that was the only client I saw who tested on 20 servers, released in production in close to 250, and was always right. At least 90% of the time is right. The rollouts didn't fail. The testing, what was done at 20 servers, still performed the same at 250 servers in production when it was released.
So there are a few different things you can do. There's no right answer. It's very environment, very customer specific.
One thing that I can tell you was working, and that works at Woolworths as well, is heavily controlled release management. Heavily controlled release management. Once you have tested a particular package, let's say you need to apply discounts on biscuits, you need to send a discount code that 10 times tomorrow would be available for $1. You need to send that code package that scans on every POS machine. Woolworths has 60,000 POS machines in Australia, 2,800 stores. None of the stores talk to each other. All of them are islands. They talk to one central location, not from one, so you cannot connect to the other store, which means they're not a part of the Active Directory. So what do you do in that case? And Woolworths' release management success rate is more than 80%. That's very, very impressive. Heavily impressive figures there. What they do is, as soon as they test the package, they've done all of that, all the teams which are involved in the total process lose complete control. They are sidelined, and the pioneer is the release management team. Even if it's a CIO, everyone's sidelined. Everything goes to release management, and they will send out packages in a very controlled fashion, test on each of the stores, on one computer on each of the stores, and that's how it works. I mean, to your point, we can't have equal scalability everywhere, but as IT professionals, as people who will enable these situations, we need some sort of control, which Woolworths gave to their release management team in this case, which ensures that it's a success. If not, the rollback is quick.
So you're saying because each store is essentially a silo, it can be benchmarked?
I'm not saying their architecture can be a benchmark, but the release management process that they follow is certainly a benchmark.
Okay.
So you can use a release management process. Don't get me wrong, and I hear what you're saying.
That's one of the things that I saw.
But technically speaking, you wouldn't be able to use a release management. So the efficiency of a release management process is really important, not about it. But technically speaking, you wouldn't be able to use the release management process to model the scalability of any setup. You can use it to determine how efficiently the code.
Totally with you, but it would certainly reduce the number of errors, or reduce the impact of that errors.
Spot on.
That's what
spot on.
I've seen both the customer, one in the US and this customer here, Woolworths, doing that way.
Spot on.
I think it's a case of you understand what your release is, test your release, you know what the impact's going to be, so limiting any possible change to that release.
Yeah, but don't get me wrong, there are numerous things that can fall over in that situation as well, right? Release management is not going to help you. I mean, I can pick a few different things that will fall over. But you're spot on, release management is really a good option in terms of working out your rollback strategy and making sure that you've got a watertight approach to actually rolling it out, so that if you have issues, you can roll it back. Give me a couple of minutes, I'll just close this off and then we'll come back to that. So cloud service SLAs, big gotcha, watch out, right? And this is me talking about it, I don't know what your experience is. Cloud vendors, and that includes Accenture, so I'm saying everyone will never sign up to an end-to-end SLA. Never ever sign up to an end-to-end SLA, end-to-end. Why? Because their applications are within the data center. Be careful as performance guys, when you are getting your customer to sign up for an SLA, and when you as a performance architect are responsible for delivering it, keep in mind the cloud vendor is not going to basically be a fallback approach. You're never going to be able to fall back on that guy, because his SLA starts within the data center and ends within the data center. Okay, and your SLA, sorry?
They really can't control it.
Absolutely. So they might, you're right, they're not able to control, you're spot on. And that's where I've found us as architects having a lot of issues, because the customer doesn't care, right? I mean, we go out and build all these nice sexy architectures which cross multiple geographies and multiple different platforms, multiple data centers, but then you're living with the latency and the challenges around the internet. So that's one of the things. But yeah, that's just my experience with working with the cloud. Going into the last one, just going into post-production or post-go live. from a capacity management, those of you who
Trevor, we have until 7:30, don't worry.
Yeah.
So don't rush, don't worry. Take your
So this is the last one. I just wrap it up. So from a and this is post go live. How do you manage performance? Right. A lot of us, including me, when I started out, watch CPU utilization. As the CPU utilization goes up, I say, okay, it's gone to 70%. Time to chuck in a new box. If you're lucky enough to actually be using the cloud, something like Amazon, or if you're using rack space, you can have auto scalability. But most of our customers are not that smart to have auto scalability for all their apps, right? We've got to be a little bit more intelligent in the way we manage infrastructure. Try to correlate your infrastructure workload, which is CPU and memory, with your business workload, which is your transactions, your messages. Get both of them, and things like CA's got tools. There are BMC's got tools. There are a few tools out there which allow you to capture those business metrics, infrastructure metrics, correlate them on top of each other, and give you a more intelligent view of how the application is performing in production. So you're not just looking at CPU, but you're actually looking at what business is actually driving that CPU utilization. And based on the business forecasts, you can procure infrastructure as compared to just looking at the infrastructure forecasts, things like that. So yeah, I mean, just I thought it would be a little bit of a filler, just share some of my experiences. But yeah, open the floor to questions and anything else that you might want to talk about.
Yeah, that'd be so much easier if it was like that.
The mention about SLAs being in the cloud scenario,
Yep.
the cloud providers and the SLAs,
Yep.
I think that market's changing. AWS is giving hard numbers. Azure is following some numbers. That is when Azure, a couple of months back,
Yep.
when Azure was down for
Yep.
a few hours, they had a major